Hello, Gordon. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
And you, Emma.
I've told you a little bit about this new channel of mine and the long interviews that I'm doing. So thank you for taking part. And as I mentioned, there's a kind of a three-part structure, roughly, past, present, and future. So could you start then by kind of introducing yourself a little bit in terms of what what led you into Quakers in the first place? Tell us a little bit about that faith journey that led you to seek out Quaker meeting to begin with, and then what made you stay, and just to give us an idea of that story for you.
So, Emma, I go with what comes. So we'll see what comes and how long this takes. You may have to interrupt me. So, I mean, I'm 54 and I got involved with Quakers about 10 to 11 years ago. So that was around 44. And I kind of see people talk about faith journey, and it's a good expression because I see landscapes in my spiritual journey and I see the interior world. And so I can see all these places I've been, like landscapes, and I see Quakers as the most recent landscape. So I've been through numerous landscapes, i.e., religious communities. Um, so maybe rather than go right back, unless you want me to, if I go more recent, about 22 years ago, I had been involved with, at that time, the landscape was a Pentecostal church. And I've been involved with Pentecostal charismatic churches since about the age of 11 or 12. And I came to a point where I just wanted to dim the noise down. And it was that time when everything was becoming acoustic, unplugged. And I just thought, I just want to plug everything and see what happens. So there's no drums, there's no music, there's no sounds. Let's just clear it all out. And I discovered retreat centres, and there was one in Oxford in a village called Stanton St John, and I used to go there, just experiment. It was self guided. It wasn't organised retreats or anything. And I was reading a book, and the book was by Margaret Silf or Self, depending on how you pronounce it, called Landmarks, I think. And I read that book, and it really, to use that word that everybody uses, resonated. It really resonated with me, and at the end of it, it said, if you're interested in more, you can write to Christian Life Community. Now, I kind of discovered through the book, the Christian Life Community was a lay order of the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits. Now, coming from a Protestant background in Northern Ireland that I was coming from, I'm like, oh, Jesuits? Mm. But one of the things that I've learned in this landscape journeying is to be open to what Quakers usually call the Spirit, but I would say the Holy Spirit, um, to go places that I wouldn't necessarily want to go. So I wrote to them and they sent me the information, and I thought, oh. So I went along to a local meeting in St. Albans. There's two groups in St. Albans, contemplative prayer. And I thought, if they say the rosary, I'm out of here. So I'm actually still a member of this group 21 years later, and we've never said the rosary. Not that that would be a total problem now, but so I guess what happened there is I was learning quite a lot about contemplation at that stage, and we would have 15 minutes of silence, and we would use a gospel from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, a passage, and we'd work our way through it over 2 weeks. And as I say, so 21 years, so about 11 years in, I thought I needed more than the 15 minutes. I needed extended periods of stillness. And that's when I started to think about the Quakers. And then I kind of popped along just to experience it.
So tell me about that experience then. What you went along one day uh, to the Quaker meeting for the first time with all of this history. What was that first experience like? Can you remember that?
Well, so I knew about Quakers from Portadown, where I'm from in Northern Ireland, because there was a Quaker meeting house there, although it closed not that many years ago. And I actually got to go inside it when it was closed, but that was the only time I was inside it. So I was always aware of Quakers growing up. But well, what's interesting is it was mainly business people in my town that were connected with the Quakers. And the windows were quite frosted, which isn't typically Quaker, which meant that it always seemed I was always intrigued by this little sort of gingerbread meeting house, which is now a funeral parlor actually. Um, and but I never went inside because I always thought I wasn't consciously aware then, but I am now that there was a class thing that I was involved in lots of different churches around the estate I lived in and stuff. But Quakers just seemed a little bit more upper to where I was in terms of class. So I was aware of these Quakers and was intrigued by these Quakers. Of course, being in England, you can be anybody you kind of want to be. Well, at least people will see you as Irish usually, and maybe Northern Irish, and well, jokingly, you're kind of all the same. So the class distinction isn't so much there. And so I popped into St Albans Quakers about 21, 22 years ago as well, and just sat and experienced the silence. And occasionally, I think I popped in, but there was nothing long lasting. So this time, 10 years ago or so, I was kind of in transition in terms of my landscapes because one of the landscapes I'd also gone to was Unitarians just prior to the Quakers, and that was in Hampstead. And so I was kind of leaving Unitarians and beginning with the Quakers. So there's usually an overlap with me. So there was that overlap. And I think because of the 15-minute silences, I had become acquainted, and I would also experience silence myself in the retreats and even at home. But it was different, and it takes a time. It's not as simple as sometimes people think. For instance, in Unitarians, we used to occasionally do on an evening, we would do like what we thought was a Quaker evening. So we would all sit there and in a circle, and we would think we were doing what Quakers do. If you feel prompted to speak, speak. Well, I can understand why we did that, but haven't been involved now for the time that I've been, and I would say it would take you at least 5 to 6 months of going to Quaker meetings to because it's so intuitive to understand well, if you can understand actually, maybe it's a soul thing more than an understanding thing to have a sense of what is going on and what's going on inside you and going on inside the meeting. So I can't quite remember my first meeting, but I didn't feel particularly uncomfortable or anything.
No. I'm fascinated by the Jesuit background because I came across a Jesuit who ran a retreat in daily life.
Yeah.
So in the university I used to work in, it was a Catholic founded university, and in the chapel, I got quite involved in chapel activities there. So this Jesuit would come in and do a retreat in daily life and a week
Hmm.
whereby he would stay at the university or at the college, we called it really, and he would provide some kind of teaching sessions. Things like, stand there and imagine God is looking at you. I don't know if that's a familiar concept. And
Hmm.
then we'd look at looking back on your week and going through the thinking around that and reflecting on that, and then prayerful reading. I forget the technical terms for all these things now, but I just loved it. His name was Stephen, and I thought I really had some very profound conversations with him during that week, and he'd offer kind of I forget what he'd call them, but these kind of one-to-one sessions where we'd talk about my prayer life, I think. And it was just
Hmm.
wonderful because I had this hectic diary, um, which at the time I thought was important, I suppose, and I'd cram into it these moments of prayer during that week. And it made me very fond of Jesuits, I must admit. I don't know anything about them. I don't know. I didn't have any prejudice, if you like. I didn't have any kind of
Hmm.
thoughts about them in advance. But I really felt it was a great privilege to take part in that. What
Hmm.
what are you left with then? Tell me what are your thoughts about the Jesuit way and how that has influenced your own spirituality?
Yeah, so I detect something about about me, which may be common amongst all people, but I'm aware of it within me, is that I have to really find things for myself. So when you get a name like Jesuits, or you even get a name like Quakers, you might have all sorts of ideas. Like I said, you had an idea of middle class and beyond. Me as a child, young person growing up.
Yeah.
Jesuits, I mean, I was coming from a very Protestant background, which was pretty anti-Catholic, where I lived in Northern Ireland. And so the Jesuits were seen like almost a bit like the Secret Service of the Catholic Church. So well, they were the Counter Reformation. So it's curious that Ignatius of Loyola, who
That's
is the
right.
founder of the Jesuits, was around the same time as Luther. And so, whilst Luther was doing the Reformation, um, uh, Ignatius was seen as the Counter Reformation. Although, strangely, well, curiously more than strangely, is Ignatius was imprisoned by the Inquisition himself because of what he was discovering as a layperson first, before he then, the Pope at the time, then gave permission for it to become an order. So my discovery of what Jesuits is my discovery, like Quakers, of what Quakers is. So the big thing is that stereotype has gone, because being involved with Christian Life Community, which is a lay order. So the Jesuits leave us to get on with it. They appoint an ecclesiastical assistant who is usually a Jesuit, and there's links, but they're not over controlling of us. But I think it's about, what are you looking for? What's the treasure that you're after, in a sense? And the treasure of the Society of Jesus, which is the proper name for Jesuits, is is the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. So what you're talking about, their treat in daily life, is what is used as, well, the instructions within that. So I partook in the retreat in daily life about 14 years ago, but that went on for 9 months. But before I jump to that, if we do jump to that, I think for me, being part of a Christian Life Community, so I'm still a member of Christian Life Community, and interestingly, although I'm not a Roman Catholic, no one's ever said I had to be. The group I'm in, curiously, is now, there's five of us, and there's only one Roman Catholic in our group now, because, a bit like what you're saying, there's an attraction to Ignatian spirituality. And what is that for me? It's discovering the imagination. So people say contemplation, but I think a better word would be imagination for people, where simply you use your senses, taste, touch, sight, sound, and you place yourself in the scene. So if you take an example of, say, Jesus calming the storm, you use your imagination to be in that ship. Now, in some of my imaginations, I've been a mouse on the ship. So I've been a mouse, and that's pretty kiddish, isn't it? But whatever speaks to you. So I've been a mouse, and I've observed what's going on through the eyes of a mouse, at least in my imagination, and saw this guy Jesus, and saw these disciples, and saw this interact. But I also hear the wind. I also feel the storm. I can taste the sea salt, and it's a very live experience. So you would remain in that for maybe, well, you could do 5 minutes, but probably 15 minutes would be the better time, and then something may happen to you in that experience. either Jesus could speak to you, or the disciples, or just your own observations. So that's probably what I carry with me in my life. And so each day I will try and read the passage. So we do like maybe 6 or 7 verses, and we stay with it for the 2 weeks. And yeah, it's just a very, very rich nourishment. And of course, you're thinking, here's me doing this Catholic practice as well as being a Quaker. But you know what life's like. We're integrated as a person, so I
Yeah,
can these things
absolutely.
become part of me. And other people might think, "Well, how can you do that or that or that?" But it's actually been the way of my life from a child that I would go anywhere, which was usually churches where they were doing free things for kids, and no one told me you didn't, that you couldn't go to more than one. So, in one example of this, I was in the Salvation Army Sunday school, and I was also in the Methodist Sunday school. And we were trying to do a band in the Salvation Army, a youth band, and they had a joint carol service. But I was also in the choir of the Methodist Sunday school. So we had this situation where I'm in my junior soldier uniform in the Salvation Army. 1 minute I'm in the Methodist choir singing, then I'm in the Salvation Army band, and so the two met. But that's I'm telling this story about the Quakers and Ignatian spirituality, and so I see in my life from childhood that this pattern continues.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It makes complete sense to me, Gordon. It really does. Because similarly, when I, you know, was in that retreat week, I did it 2 or 3 times. Um, what I love about it is that if you're in the right place, I was never judged. I was never made to feel anything other than complete and total warm welcome. And I think that's how I know whether I'm in the right place or not. And I think it's only enriched my spiritual
Hmm.
practice, and anything that enriches that is going to enrich the Quaker community that I'm part of. So I'm really interested in your Pentecostal period then. So it sounds like you were Pentecostalists, what, for in your 20s and 30s? Is that about right? How long was that for? What was the
Well,
impact on you?
it started when I was about 12, actually.
Oh, okay.
So it started off with the charismatic movement, if you're familiar with the charismatic movement. So the charismatic movement is really Pentecostalism, but in mainstream churches. So the charismatic movement was big and continues to have a role in the Catholic Church. Um, but it also spread into most mainline churches. I happened to be in the Methodist church I was talking about um, at the time when I was in the Boys Brigade. And the leader of the Boys Brigade had got very excited about this speaking in tongues and this charismatic movement. As I say, charismatic movement was very mainstream, but what happened is you would get pockets of people in churches. And what happened, unfortunately, in my church, and I was very young, is that there were people that didn't like it. So maybe like Quakers, you get the non-theists, and you get the universalists, and you get the Christocentrics, and people, they'll talk differently maybe in their own groups than they will in the whole community, and that kind of happened. And but before that happened, he spoke. Now, there were some questions about whether it was appropriate to be speaking to 11 and 12-year-olds about this experience. And partly as a result, the Boys Brigade was actually closed down because it kind of got out of hand. And what did get out of hand was he was telling us, I mean, as I'm talking to you and I'm saying about that imaginative experience that Ignatian spirituality gives. I'm brought back now and you know what, this conversation is unprompted, but I'm brought back to how he spoke when I was 11 or 12-year-old. And what he was saying was, you can experience Jesus like he was 2,000 years ago. I'm like, what? And, and so then he's talking about, well, there's these passages where after he left, he said the Spirit would come and these things would happen and the gifts of the Spirit. And so he referenced them and he said, okay. And I kind of, there was three of us. And I said, well, I'm up for this. What do we do? This experience. And so one of the lads, he had a dream the night before or something, and he said, "Oh, he felt that this should happen." So basically, what happens is people lay hands on you and pray that you're baptized in the Holy Spirit. So he had this dream about this old mission house, which was run down and derelict, and that we should go in there. Now, it wasn't too far; it was next door to the guy's house. This was out in the countryside. So the next day, we agreed that we would go there at, I don't know what time it was, 11 o'clock in the morning, and this we would see what would happen. So somebody must give me a lift because I never had a car, and so we went into this old mission hall and it didn't have floorboards. Well, the floorboards were all over the place. Anyway, it was quite simple. Is that there was the two kind of leaders, and they kind of prayed over you, and so we each had our turn, and and unlike this conversation with you, Emma, I can come with things if they do particularly excite me. I can come with things with quite a lot of excitement. I can't always explain why that might be, but I do. Anyway, so I remember being very excited before it even got to this experience, thinking, what is going to happen? So I accept, there's a psychological element possibly to this. So it then came to me, and they laid hands on me, and the sign that this happened, that you'd been baptized or you'd received the Holy Spirit, was that you would speak in tongues. So I don't know whether you would say no pressure there. Anyway, I think the other two had. So they prayed for me, and I accept that people could, say there's a lot of psychology going on here, but for the moment, let's suspend that. And so they prayed for me, and I just remember, I think one of them then kind of spoke to me as if God was speaking to me, which is something that can happen as well within charismatic Pentecostal circles. But you could say that happened in Quaker circles as well, if we're being channels of the Spirit. So anyway, but there was this love. There was this massive amount of what he was saying about love to me and God's love for me. And now, whether he was speaking for God or not is another question. But at that moment, as 11, 12-year-old, as a kid that hadn't felt particularly loved, this created quite a massive emotional reaction in me. So much so that I can remember the floorboards that were there. My tears had hit them. It wasn't quite a puddle. I'm not going to be dramatic about that, but I could see that there was so much tears coming that the floor was wet. At least that's how I remember it. And then I did speak in tongues. Now, again, you could say, and I actually still speak in tongues. I will still speak in tongues in my own private prayer life. I don't do it at Quaker meetings, or I don't do it publicly, but it's a gift. And again, psychologically, people could say this, that, and the other. But that's been with me since I'm 11. So that's been with me now 43 years. And like it says, when you don't know what to pray, it talks about the moans and groans of the inward person. But I think tongues also give an expression of something that you don't know exactly what's happening or what you're saying, but it certainly gives you an expression. So that was the outcome of that experience, but that was still within a Methodist church. As I say, the church then had a split, and then unfortunately, as a result of that, I then drifted out of church because it was difficult, because some people were feeling, what you're up to isn't of God, and heavily questioning. That was difficult for a 12-year-old to kind of handle it. My
Yeah.
parents weren't church people, and they were also concerned about some of the. I mean, can you
Yeah.
imagine 12-year-olds speaking in tongues? And it was a little bit of the talk of our part of the town, and that's why a lot of questions were asked about, whether was this appropriate, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm really interested in that story. And, as you say, we integrate these experiences ourselves. And I suppose what I'm left thinking is about how you feel that part of you is welcomed within a Quaker setting. I mean, it's really interesting you talked then about moans and groans because only the other week I shared something in a small group. We were talking about ministry.
Mm,
And I said something like, what perhaps you don't realize is that when I feel moved to minister, and I'm really kind of struggling with, I really don't want to have to say it, if you like. There's a kind of a groan that I just said, I don't even know if I do groan outwardly, but it's certainly an inward
mm,
groan. Um, and then I don't usually fight it too hard, and I say it, and I sit down and think, right, thankfully that's over with. Um, but I do get a sense that this kind of expressiveness is really not part of how British Quakers work. And it's I mean, I don't know whether it's that class thing that you just talked about. Um, but this kind of you know hyper expressiveness, if you like, that perhaps would describe the kinds of spirituality you're talking about. I don't see any of that in Quakers. I don't see any of that at all. And if anything, that's all kind of kept quiet, and that the quiet becomes almost a cover then of
mm.
sweep everything underneath this quiet. So how do you feel welcomed in your full spirituality?
Yes, and I was, we had a couple of newcomers or people inquiring this Sunday, and the way they were speaking was kind of reminding me of myself. One guy was just under 30, and he said, I've been a member of this church, but I'm just a different stage of my life, and I'm looking at a bit more contemplation. The other guy was probably in his 40s. He also said he was from another church as well. And he said he just needed a bit more peace and stuff. And so in speaking with those guys afterwards, you see, I think I can be largely fully me because within Quakers or the community I'm part of in St. Albans, nobody's telling me what to believe, right? So but that doesn't mean I can't have my own beliefs and I can't have my own whatever, however I express myself. So being with others, they also can have whatever their belief systems are or however they live. But actually, I don't feel diminished in any way. Maybe, I mean, I know some of what you're speaking about, um, but I'm kind of free to keep growing. And you know, what you're talking about the moans. When I minister, it sounds quite a term, doesn't it? Minister. When I feel moved to speak, it's the same feelings that I had. Say in the Pentecostal church, they'll have things like they call words of knowledge or prophecy, or where there'll be a period of time, possibly more traditional Pentecostal churches, rather than the more the newer ones. So there'll be a space where anyone, if they feel moved, can speak. And so that could be in tongues, and then somebody would interpret the tongues. And you can read about this. I think it's in Acts where it talks about the order of things and how it should be. So in those moments that I felt moved within Pentecostalism, that feeling, that moving, is the same that I have in a Quaker meeting. It's not different. It's the same movement. And I tell you what it goes back to. Well, what I often think about is when I jumped off the top board of the swimming pool when I was about 9, I was on the top board and I thought, oh, I can't do this. I can't do this. And I must have been up there, I don't know, for 10 minutes or more, walking backwards and forwards, and all these emotions going on. And then I just did it. And I remember, obviously falling and hitting it. And it's that emotion stays with me for a lot of things, but particularly it comes with Quaker meetings, and I'm brought back to that experience where all these feelings are going on about before I would speak. Now, of course, you might not speak, but usually, so it's interesting. I'm even going back to the swimming pool experience because, in a sense, that's not even. Somebody might say, "Well, that wasn't a spiritual experience," but then that gets us to talk about, well, what are the experiences that stay with us in life, and where did they come from? And there probably are spiritual experiences, but they're just not within the context sometimes of what we would regard as a spiritual environment.
So you would you say you're Jesus centered or Christ centered or Christian Quaker? I mean, do you put a do you put a label on how you are?
Well, I think it's difficult not to use labels, but I try not to. And so in my own thinking about, because people have an image of this Jesus guy, and one of the things that I prefer to do is say to people, provocatively in some ways, is he never was called Jesus, because Jesus is an English term that in the Aramaic, his name was probably something like Ishua. Now it's not Yeshua, which is the Hebrew, but in English I would spell it something like Eashoa. And if you go to some of these Aramaic speakers, you'll get the name. So the name is not like Jesus. Now, why does that matter? That matters because it centers him in a different place, and it makes me think, because I did do this. Um, I thought Jesus was a Northern Irish Protestant as I grew up as a kid. you know, I, I thought he was one of us, as I think most people think. Particularly as a child, that the culture in which you're in and what the stories you're reading. So I'm reading about the Galilee, the Lake Galilee, but I'm thinking of Lough Neagh, which is up the road from me. So all these places, what's it called, cultural appropriation. I'm making them where I live, and I went to Jerusalem 2 years ago, and I went in 1999 as well, and I it's just great to see these places that I had known so much about since a kid. But going back to the Jesus thing, so um, yeah, I think if you ask me to put my hand up, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I have a relationship with Yeshua or Jesus. So I do have a personal relationship with Jesus. Um, but I mean, one of the things I learned from Unitarians is, and someone once said to me, because I was quite involved with the union, said, "Go, Gordon, I hear you're a Christian. You're a practicing Christian." So I said to the guy, I said, "Well, you watch me, and you make that judgment." Because one of the things about the Unitarians, and this is I learned a lot from all these different schools of of uh, of religious worship, is, if you want to know what we believe, Emma, watch how we
What
behave.
we do, yeah.
My beliefs come out in how I live. I might think I have all these beliefs, but the truth is those beliefs come out in how I live. So the truth will show up in my behavior. So yeah, yeah. How do you feel about me saying? I don't know. I'm asking you the question
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Is it hear me saying I have a personal relationship with Jesus? So I feel I. I mean, I've known him a long time, so as in Jesus. Um, but it's been a change in Jesus, partly through trying to see, things like what I say, debunk the cultural baggage, which is necessary, I think. In one part, as people are educated and you're trying to you're trying to learn things, but then trying to see beyond it, and then there's nothing like your own experiences. This is going back to what I said to you about. I have a need to discover Quakers for myself, not anybody else's version of Quakers. It has to be my interpretation and
Yeah,
integration
yeah.
and applied. So when you ask me what I call myself a Christian, I'm not always good at answering the questions. I don't always call myself a Quaker because I say I find myself amongst people. I'm talking like an whatever. I find myself in a place where the people call themselves Quakers.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of recognizing the tribe because I've gone through so many tribes. But sometimes I won't call myself a Quaker.
It's interesting.
Even though I am a member of Quaker and I'm an elder of our meeting, but I just think you say a name, what does it actually mean?
Yeah. And I
And it's
suppose,
generalized as well. Because you as a Quaker, Emma, or me as a Quaker, the only way you're going to know what that Quaker is by getting to know who you are, who I am, rather than thinking, oh, you do this, you do that, you believe this, you believe that, because that's what people do.
yeah, yeah. Well, there's a few things going through my mind about, I'm fascinated that you've had, as you call it, a number of different tribes, and what there's a very well-known professor in Welsh here in Wales who really talks about the windows into our experiences that different languages give, and that once you understand a few different languages, you start to see things in much more detail and much more richness. So I'm that's been going through my mind as you talk about this Pentecostal and Jesuit and Unitarian and Methodist, all of these different perspectives, and now Quakers. So that's partly what I'm thinking, that richness
Mhm, mhm.
is there. And what you just said about, to know Quakers is to know a Quaker and to find out who they are. I'm just wondering, I do think there's more that can be said about what Quakers are, and I'm curious, how do you describe Quakers to other people who are not familiar with it, or perhaps somebody in your Christian life group? If I've probably got the name of that wrong. Um,
No, no, it's Christian Life Group,
yeah,
a Christian Life Community. Actually, one of the people that's in it, I met at the Quakers. They were visiting. They typically go to an Anglican church. Although one of their family members is a member of the Quakers as well. Um, so there's a lot more crossover going on anyway, and it depends. Like again, there's a uniqueness in each community. So I would say the
mm,
Swansea Quaker community has probably got elements that you wouldn't see in other Quaker communities necessarily. Um, so how would I describe it? Well, I suppose I talk about things like a journey, like we're talking now, and I would say, um, well, I'm giving myself time to think. What I find myself in at times is we turn up, there's nothing programmed, and we wait for the spirit. And if someone is so moved to speak, they they will. Now, maybe I will then get into a conversation about person might say, well, what are they speaking from? And I said, well, that'll be a good question because the breadth of Quakers certainly in England. Um, and so a non-theist Quaker, what are they speaking from? But having read some of this stuff, it begins to get interesting, like you say, about the language and the different language. Because if someone's having the experience, but the language is dividing people, what I want to tune into is the experience of they're having that experience, which is the same experience, but I'm describing it a different way than they. But the experience essentially is the same. I might not say that to somebody in a first introductory. So what I would say is we're there, we're waiting, and partly as an individual, learning to be with silence. And so, I mean, I can be quite contradictory, and it'll probably come across even in this conversation, Emma. But I have a notion that God is silence. Like the earth around us, or I also have images of water and fish, and us, even when we're sitting in meeting, in a sense, being like fish in water. That the silence, which isn't just obviously in a meeting house, but can be anywhere. I get a sense of, I'm using the word God, and I don't want to rehearse what everybody does say to try and explain themselves about what they're talking about. But silence itself, to me, speaks of the of God. I was trying to say the word omnipotence, but I can't always say omnipotence. That sense that God is everywhere. Silence, silence does something that just the mere silence and being silent. Maybe there's a meeting of something, the divine with whatever I am, whatever we are. That's not really answering your question, Em, about
No.
what do I say to people.
And well, I'm thinking about our Quaker meetings and our community, and I've been thinking as you've been speaking about tribe. You used the word tribe, and I'm aware that you've been through a number of different tribes. So I mean, this is a tricky question for you, but would you say that this is a lifelong commitment for you, and is that important? Because it feels to me like I can't imagine ever going anywhere else. But I don't know if that's important. And I don't want to judge other people for perhaps moving on to something different. And I suppose I might move on to something different, but it feels to me like this is the only place where I can really be spiritually my own person and have some kind of creative contribution to that, rather than being a passive recipient, which is just not as alive for me. I don't want to just go to a church and get it, um, put upon me, if
Hmm.
you like.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts around whether commitment matters or, um, so if, for example, it wasn't working out for you, or you started to feel that, your community wasn't quite fitting you anymore, would you try to change your community, or would you simply go and find something else?
Well, there's a lot in your question, and I definitely want to pick up on the lifelong commitment thing. But what I would say about, if I've been around 10 to 11 years with St. Albans Quakers, and probably been a member for about six, and have already done different roles, partly because as things are changing and maybe there aren't as many people. That's a good thing about Quakers in a way, is that you don't have to wait long before you be asked to do something, partly because of necessity. Um, but I would say in the 10, 11 years, in that length of time, I would have, the shadows, the dark, the light of me will have shown, will have been displayed at some point to people there. And so I would say that's happened. And when it's happened, we have worked through issues. Yeah, so it's not like I can think of one particular issue that I did, I'm still there. We worked it through. We had a little bit of facilitation. I mean, it wasn't a big thing. It was just, the rub of people where somebody gets maybe upset, and then, somebody else gets upset, and so that happens. So in that regard, it's not like I would disappear just because there was a problem. But when you say about the lifelong commitment, um, yeah. So I guess this is. I was once. I mean, years ago, I was described as a spiritual gypsy, and that was a bit of a derogatory term at the time. Um, but I kind of embrace it, I suppose, now. In the sense that maybe I have to accept that, well, I think I do accept anyway. People may need and people may want to be in communities for life, and that's fine. People are, but that has not been my way. So, as I say, from a kid where I didn't really know, I just did, and I find myself in different places, and I didn't think there was a problem with it, and that's kind of stayed. So, I remember on one occasion when I was in a particular Pentecostal church for about 10 years. And there were some so interesting. There were some issues where I was thinking, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about that. And so I'm having this conversation with God where I'm going, but God. So I talk to God, but I also talk to Jesus, and then we get into interesting things about who's God and who's Jesus. But anyway, for the moment, just like God, the thing is, if I leave here, where am I going to go? Because there is that sense of community and belonging and identity. And what I felt came back to me was, Gordon, I'm bigger than any church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm bigger than any church. And it's like, well, okay, my interpretation. Is it the relationship with me, or is it the relationship with a group of people? Now, it could be a relationship with a group of people, but I think what the Spirit was saying to me was, so my lifelong commitment, I hope, and who can say, but I've picked up on that word. My lifelong commitment is to God. And if that means I move communities, and I have done, I move communities. And that's why I talk about landscapes. And I guess some people might talk about sojournering, that word. Um, but how else to live, Emma, than how you live? What I mean is, Lassie, do you remember the story of Lassie, the
Yeah.
dog? Yeah. So I don't know if you remember, but I see these things imprinted me as a kid. And then there was a Littlest Hobo as well, which was similar.
Mm-hmm.
So Lassie stayed with a community for however long she needed to be in that community,
Yeah.
and then she moved on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also, Emma, about, and this has been a big challenge for me, and it's a great thing for me to let things go. Is, are we seeing walls of communities, or are we seeing people? So that's the Quakers are, that's the Methodists are, that's the Muslims are, that's the Hindus are. And one of the things I think I've been learning, or been part of what I've been doing, is to see beyond the door and go beyond the door, and to see the people and the commonality of people. And yeah, so I think sometimes limiting ourselves. Well, everybody has to make their own decision. I've been there 11 years. I haven't felt moved to move as yet. But
Yeah.
if I did, and I felt it was a strong move, yes, I'd have to honor what I felt was part,
Yeah.
because those experiences I'm telling you about, the Jesuits and going places, Unitarians even, and even Quakers to some extent, certainly, in England, where you're going into an environment where people may say, well, I don't believe in God. I come from a background and culture where God was never questioned. If anybody
Mm.
said, you know, that there is no God, you go, what are you talking about? It was just so much of your reality and your social reality that nobody ever questioned it. Of course, it's acceptable to question it now, but um, walking into all these different places has changed me.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that that one's commitment is to God rather than a particular church or a group of people. Except that sometimes you can see one's service is to a particular community, and that may well change, I suppose. I suppose part of what I wanted to do in these conversations was to look at the current state of Quakerism. So where this came from was in October. I went to a Future of Quakerism conference, and there's about 200 people there thinking about the state we're in, if you like. And one of the things they talked about was that populations of churches are declining, and that the numbers in Quakers in Britain are now about 10,000, and that we're an aging group, that the average age is about 60. And over the course of the last 10 years, that average has gone up to 61. It's a very minor kind of shift, but I call that a society of
Mm,
elders myself, but I think probably many churches are in that position, though not all. And I don't see that 10,000 is anything to worry about. I think it's great to be part of a community of 10,000 people. But I do feel that part of my commitment, if you like, and perhaps I care too much and I'm willing to have that fed back to me, that I feel some sense of wanting to have some contribution to open up these conversations, because I worry that maybe worry is not quite the right word. I'm pained in some way by what I see as a very small, closed-minded insularity within Quakers, that there's one way to be, and there's a particular set of political viewpoints, and to be too much into Jesus is not quite the done thing, and to be too so for example, to support farming and meat eating is not the done thing, and to be a little bit questioning about, I don't know, all sorts of things, and there's certain things politically which override things around people's spiritual experiences. And that we've started to become much more of a social movement with particular, maybe social justice aims, than we are talking about what we've just spent an hour talking about, which I think is much more what I hope for from the Quaker Church, if you like. And I suppose I feel moved to do something about that and to talk to people about that. But maybe, listening to you, maybe I'm just not in the wrong place, but I just need to recognize that this is not necessarily something that I need to be so attached to. Um, but what do you make of how Quakers are at the moment? And do you feel frustrated or pained or in any way about how things are done in current ways?
so picking up on that issue of place, this is a place we are now. You in Swansea and me in St Albans, you in my small corner, and it sounds a bit like that to him, doesn't it? So I guess 'cause the place we're in is where in a sense we're farming, or we're doing whatever we're doing, for however long we're here. I mean, death could take either of us, and then we wouldn't certainly be here. Um, so I think it's important about the place you're in and what's happening in the place you're in, and levels of commitment and stuff. So I don't. So for me, that doesn't have to be questioned. For even if it's not a lifelong commitment. I think so much of this shows up your own psychology, not yours, but mine. Um, I think I realize, and I've always known this. I'm quite a local person. Um, I find it. I was talking to some people from the county council recently, and I said to them, I struggle to get the county council into my head about how it works and feel a part of it. Whereas, St Albans Council, I can get connected to, and so the local. So talking about Quakers in that regard, I struggle to connect with the national apparatus, like Britain Yearly Meeting. I mean, I've been 6 times. But I think I also see from other things that I'm involved in is that when you step things up to like even regional or national levels, we become something different. We relate to each other differently, and we become something different. So if I keep to the local, um,
Mm.
and I've heard many people say this in different places, the Unitarians will say the same thing, and Baptists will say the same thing and stuff. And, why can't people discover the richness of what we've got? Um, so we all think we've got richness, but it's like people have to discover things for themselves, and what we think is rich um, may not necessarily be rich for others. You're talking about this conversation, which is very kind of what I would say spiritual nourishment and nourishment generally, and then contrasting it with the social movements. Um, I actually feel quite at ease being me, knowing that there are these dominant trends within English Quakerism. I don't know if I can say British Quakerism or English or even Southern English Quakerism because it's only within the scope that I've got. Um,
Mm.
I sometimes think, you know, even me reading it, never mind an outsider. So and I want to be sensitive here, but if you look at the friend for Quaker Week, that edition that's
Yeah,
supposed to um, be attractive to other people,
yeah,
it's pretty heavy about things. It's not what I would say a beginner's guide, and so I shouldn't just take aim at the friend. So I think what I'm trying to say is even an hour of silence. It took me 44 years
hmm,
to get to a place where I could sit for an hour in silence, being the person that I am, that can be quite distracted and the rest. So I've had this notion of, again, swimming pools come into mind, where you have the slow lane, the fast lane, the medium lane, where if you have the room in a Quaker meeting house, you've got 15 minutes going on, 15-minute meeting in that room, half an hour in that, 45 or an hour in another. Because I think, and you will have noticed, and I think there's a little trend if somebody looked at it, some people don't arrive until quarter to 11. We start at 10:30 because the 45 minutes is enough for them,
mm,
not the hour. So I think there's all sorts of ways of trying to let people experience what we're experiencing. It doesn't even have to be couched necessarily in Quakerism. Although I would say to people, if you want to experience it, the hour definitely troubles a lot of people that they don't think they could survive an hour in silence. So it's about becoming creative. Yet it's still, even when you become creative, I don't know whether you have to be the right person or have the right people skills. Um, you so can have all that willing, and people still don't necessarily want it. So we're seeing like ones and twos coming through the door, and they stay with us for a while, and then they disappear. And maybe it is a holding space for a time, and I think we can be that as well. A bit like as I'm saying about landscaping,
yeah.
people can journey and they can stay with us for a while, but of course you need a core group to hold that together. I wonder whether, in some ways, you could see Quakers a bit like a religious order. And of course, being in a lay order, not everybody's going to be attracted to. So there's five in our group, which is a Christian Life community. And there's not, maybe in England and Wales, because it is an English and Wales organization, there's probably no more than 500 people in Christian Life community, about 30 groups or so, maybe more than 30 groups. So you begin to wonder whether some of the attributes of how we conduct ourselves, like how you might see a religious community like nuns or monks. If you, so that's how we're perceiving it from the outside. Well, people could be perceiving us a bit like a religious order, you
Mm.
know, that, the silence. And so that can seem like, well, it's interesting, but it's not for me. And I don't really know how you make people think actually this can be for you rather than a particular type of person being drawn to a particular type of community and way of doing things.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose, you keep mentioning psychology, and I suppose part of these conversations is helping me work out, am I trying too hard really in trying to create something that is more enriching for me. I mean, about 10 years ago, I really got dissatisfied within my meeting for a while because it was almost always silent. Every single meeting was silent for an hour. And then in afterwards, they didn't like afterwards really, and nothing happened in afterward either. Now, no, that wasn't always the case, and there was sometimes ministry, and I love that community still. But it became obvious to me that it wasn't quite doing it for me. And then, there's to some extent is, how much do you simply just move and find something else? And in fact, that's what they encouraged me to do, go to another meeting where there's more going on that's going to suit you better for now. Um, but where I'm going with it is trying to talk to people about, well, you made me laugh when you talk about 15 minutes because I'm going the other way, right? So I'm thinking like we need to have 2 hour meetings. And the first hour is more kind of programmed, and the people might have music, there might be hymns, there might be um, poetry or readings or dance or whatever it is that people feel moved to do together. And that then we move into perhaps a more typical meeting for worship for the second hour. And some people, as you say, might choose to come along because they think, oh, I don't want that. I'm going to arrive late to make sure I miss all of that. Or some people might say, well, I can't sit longer than 10 minutes in silence, so I'm going to do the dancing, do the singing, and then I'm off. Or whatever. People could, mix it around a bit, but there would be more energy there. So for me, you see, the silence and the stillness is only part of the experience that I'm looking for. That to me is the first half. And I think we were speaking about this a few weeks ago. The first half is the centering down and the stillness and the quiet. But actually, then it's about experiencing something within that and hearing what God has to say to us within that. And that we can share an experience together, perhaps at the beginning, which would bring us all together more quickly. But then I think, well, why am I even wittering on and coming up with all these ideas? I think it would be right for me, but maybe it wouldn't. Um, but certainly it feels like we're a long way apart. You're talking about 15 minutes is a long time, and I'm saying let's have 2 hours.
Well, I did partake in an extended worship period on Zoom that was hosted, I think, in Ecuador, I think, or Paraguay. So they were going on for I think 2 to 3 hours, but it wasn't broken up. It was silence for the whole, well, unless you felt moved. But I'm also thinking, with this sounds appropriate, doesn't it? With it being Fox's 400th year and all that. Um, I thought, well, what can I do? So I kind of started reading Fox's journal. Curiously, he does mention St. Albans. This is a little footnote here. He does mention St. Albans in the journal, but you don't see it as St. Albans because you won't use the word saint. So it's called Albans.
Oh, right.
Um, and yeah, that's just a curious thing. So he actually was in, I don't know about whether he ever got to Swansea, but he did get to what he called Albans. But when you read his journal, and I guess he said no one spoke in his condition, and the Lord himself had to speak to him. And then from that, of course, there were other seekers around, but from that, he's energized. He has his relationship, he has his spiritual experience, and then he talks about it. But I mean, if he was sitting in a meeting for worship and you look at what's it said, 1% of Britain at one time was a Quaker or something, that what was it then that was creating such a such a movement? And I think it's because you talked about silent meetings there. That there was an article recently in the Friend, to give a positive word to it, and I think it was by young friends that had met at Jordan's, and they were looking at Penrose's painting of the presence in the midst, which is kind of Jesus, albeit that it is a white Jesus. But I guess Penrose in his head was seeing a white Jesus. But still, I was quite taken by what they were writing about, which was really, I suppose, Fox assumed, I think, that Jesus would speak to somebody, probably him if he was in the meeting, that would speak to somebody to say something. So there was an expectation of hearing something from God. Now, I still have that expectation. I do have that. But I think what's difficult, if you said that, like I'm saying it now, I know, unfortunately, and I'm going to say unfortunately, that within Quaker circles and meetings, people cringe a bit when you say that. They don't, what are you talking about? But by doing that, you're actually denying the heritage from which you've come. So, okay, if that's not for you, don't necessarily squash it or quash it, um, because the idea, the notion that God can speak through anybody sitting here in this meeting, something relevant for me or you or whoever that day, is very exciting. Um, but if it becomes a culture where it's just silence after silence after silence, or a culture develops within a particular meeting because that's how people like it, then it's lost it's dynamic, it's dynamism, it's power. If you know, and I think there's a tension that goes on there, a bit like what I was saying about that Methodist church. When you get pockets of people, and then I ended up drifting from the church because it became problematic. So maybe there needs to be a greater. We need to have a greater respect and freedom to express ourselves. And whilst this might not be for you, it is for me. Please don't hold me back.
Mm.
You know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're certainly a very broad church, aren't we? I mean, there's a lot of people amongst us who are what you might call non-theist or agnostic, or they just don't like to talk about God very much. And some people might call themselves humanist or pagan or whatever, Buddhist. It's such a broad church. Do you have any thoughts about the future, about where are we going, maybe we don't need to have opinions on it, but there was this whole conference called Future of Quakerism.
Hmm.
What would you have said there?
Well, I noticed the title, I think, in The Friend again, that said something like, "This is not death, this is transformation." And sometimes I won't read a book, but a title of a book or an article might actually get me more than having to read the particular thing. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? If it's not death, but it's transformation. But what is that transformation that's happening? Where's it bringing us to? I don't always need to know where transformation's going. Um, yeah, it's. I suppose it depends how much you're. And I hear what you're saying, Emma. I understand it, and I feel lost when things. I feel lost when religious places close, even not connected to it. Um, because I think, oh, something's gone there. There's a history. There's a community. So I know where you're going. Like, how do we, this richness. How do we keep it going? But there's another part of me that probably goes back to what I heard when I left that Pentecostal church, which is, Gordon, I'm bigger than any church, and that includes Quakers.
Yeah, yeah,
So what's more important is the life of the spirit and the spiritual life. But I know what you mean.
yeah.
If there was a loss of Quakerism, have to be reinvented.
Well, yes, but I mean, I take your point, and you said something about the local area is important to you, and I wonder, you know to to what extent do you feel that you need to shape and guide? And I mean, you said you're an elder at the moment. Do you feel any sense of a creative push there? Or is it simply a watchfulness and a waiting and a letting God
Mhm.
be here? Because I suppose for me, unless there is creativity and energy and a gentle pushing in a particular direction, you end up in a place perhaps you didn't intend to go, which might be completely silent meetings with no ministry or whatever it might
Mhm.
be. And
Sure.
and we know that meetings dwindle and then they lose their meeting house and that's the end of Quakers in that area.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and 50 years goes past. So uh, surely we have to do something. I mean, God has no hands but ours.
Sure. So there is a friend in our meeting who started doing these series of workshops once a month called The Spirit Off, which is quite an interesting title. So she's done the Spirit of Film, where someone brought in, it was Brast Off, the one in Yorkshire. I think
Oh
they
yeah.
were probably from Yorkshire. Spirit of Place, where somebody else brought in their slides and showed a particular walk that they did that had meaning for them. So this spurred off, and what she's cleverly done, but it's her gifting, is she's kind of listened out for people about what are they into, and then she's brought them in and said, "Well, can we let's do a session on this?" And
Yeah.
part of it is it's on a Saturday, is to bring people together, like to build community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes we're not. I can only speak for us, really, but I don't know how widespread it is. Sometimes we're not always good. I'm talking about Quakers possibly here. At getting behind things. That when someone starts an initiative,
Mm.
that people turn up and make a commitment to be in there, other than a Sunday morning at whatever time between 10 and 12. Um, and so if you make the effort, I mean, numbers are important or not important, but it kind of will show up where the community's at, where we're at, and this conversation, I guess, shows me up too. That if I'm totally honest, Emma, um, and this is something about where I'm at a place and my own energy. So I give energy um, to kind of what pays for a roof to be over my head, and I give energy to some other things. But I don't seem, I don't seem, although I might seem to have energy I have energy for this. I don't mind talking, um, but I don't always seem to have the energy to do much more than what I'm doing. And creative things need they need a commitment to work them out. So you challenge me with that. Um,
Well, you see,
what am I doing, and what do I need to be doing? Do I need to be doing anything, or can I just be the presence in the midst as well? Um, you know,
yeah,
uh,
yeah. There was a classic
it could be, yeah.
question. There was a
Hmm.
classic question that people used to ask of meetings is how is the spirit moving amongst you? And that, I don't know
Hmm.
if you're aware of that question. That was the question that everyone used to be asked. How is the spirit moving amongst you? And I think it just goes to the right of the heart of what you're just saying there. Where is the energy? Because as you said, you look forward to this conversation. I look forward to this conversation. We created energy for this. So I think
Hmm.
where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am, and it's full of life and full of energy and easy to put energy into it. So I think that's absolutely what Quaker meetings need to do. And yet there's always seems to be this bureaucratic layer which s- makes everything, squeezes life out of things if it can possibly do so. And I suppose I'm finding ways to just get around that, you know.
There is a group. I don't know if you've come across a group that's a fairly recent group in this past maybe 2 years called Discovering Quakers. Have
Mhm.
you have you heard of these guys? So they've set up a website and they're trying to link in with local meetings, and they're trying to put stories on their website that speak to people, you know, the people out there. And looking at some of their statistics, just from the friends and stuff, um, there seems to be something healthy and creative happening with that initiative. I noticed that Quaker Quest had been laid down and the funds have been transferred into Discovering Quakers. That in itself, though, tells you that, and that's one of the Quaker phrases that the tribe language, um, laying things down. I can't remember what the phrase is for taking things up. Well, what's the phrase for taking things up? Never mind laying things down. Anyway, my point is that there's a time to bring something about, and there's a time to lay things down. That Quaker Quest, which was very successful, over many years, and you may have thought it was going to keep running, It hasn't, but it's transferred what is left over to this new group called Discovering Quakers, who are using social media and the internet to try and tell people that want it or need it or can be nourished by it what this thing Quakers is. You know
Mm,
what the niche is that we're offering. What you're doing, it'd be interesting to see where it goes. But you're an example of an individual who needed stimulated and was stimulated by that conference. Now what you've done, you've got other people talking, like with me, you've got me talking to you, and other people can watch it, and it'd be interesting to see where that goes, and what does that generate? What's even generating in me now? Like I said to you, I'm hearing you challenge me about where's my energy and what am I doing, and am I prepared to do more, and do I need to do more? Um, so
oh,
it's good to be part of this,
yeah,
if
yeah.
nothing else.
And in
Yeah.
the end, we're meant to be channels for God love, aren't we? And kind of we don't do things in our own power. That's one of the great phrases, that we have to allow the energy of and the spirit of God to help us rather than think that we have to be powering through under our own steam.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not totally listening because I've got an idea in my head here. Just one thing, and I know time might be going on, but it's interesting, and I know you're aware of this as well. Um, so how do I talk about it? So so I'm just talking randomly here about. It's interesting that people say in prison, go to chapel, and they go to mosque, and there's a lots of faith communities in prison, and there's a high percentage of prisoners attending. Some might say, "Oh, people go to things for all sorts of reasons, but the social aspect and all that." But what's interesting is, and I think the Alpha groups looked at this. So why is it that you get people in prison doing things, and even listeners with the Samaritans training people up to be listeners in prisons and stuff, and doing lots of tasks in prison, but yet when they transition back into the community, they can't find a place to use either those skills or to be that. Now, I don't know, but that feels to me a bit like a class thing going on. Um, it feels a bit like when women were allowed to do all the jobs because the men have gone to war. I mean, I think the movement did mean that women then were in the workplace. But it's interesting that people are very creative, but sometimes they need their own spaces to be creative. I'm talking about a place like prison. But I just find it curious that that doesn't continue through. Well,
Mm.
not to the percentage that is happening inside. So that makes me think, well, so what people were getting in prison in terms of their spiritual development and spiritual needs, what happens to it when they're outside? I mean, I know some do, but it's interesting. Is it when perhaps we're in adversity that we have a greater need to
Mm.
look to the spiritual, and then when we get back into what we know, we lose it. But it's just curious about what can happen in one place but doesn't continue in another.
Yeah, at the very beginning of this conversation, you said about something to do with, some kind of class impressions that you had about certain places.
Mm,
And you said it in
mm,
a vague way, but I'm just wondering about whether the way in which Quakers come across to the general public passing by our meeting houses or whatever, they probably have an impression of what goes on in there. Um, and I'm imagining that for a lot of them saying, well, it's not for me. That's not a place where I will feel
mm.
comfortable. And even just listening to me talk, they'll say, well, that's not a place for me to be. So we talk a lot about inclusion, but I'm not sure that we're very good at particularly making a warm and welcoming place for people to come in off the streets, say. And I don't know whether
But
that's
there's a contradiction there in that though, because I'm part of a group that meets in the meeting house, which isn't a Quaker group at all. It's called Conscious Cafe. It's anybody, and they meet in the meeting house. We've got, I think, at least three recovery groups, as in Narcotics Anonymous, and I think Sex Addict Anonymous, and Alcoholics Anonymous. And like probably lots of meeting houses, we have a lot of people coming in. So there's a contradiction going on here because people must feel okay in the meeting house in their own space and creating their own thing. But there's something about the meeting that those people may not walk into the meeting room or the meeting
Yeah.
because of. But then, if you look at Quakers and people wanting to be members, and I had it as well, is that somehow there's a stereotype that says you have to be a very righteous person to be a Quaker. I don't know why I'm putting on a posh accent when I say that, um, or trying to put on a posh accent. So even people like me, and I don't know about you, but people are put off becoming members because of ideas that to be a Quaker is to be quite a saintly or upright person.
Yeah. I know.
Do you wonder how I
I
got in
mean,
now?
you see the thing is, I think the really crucial thing for me is, I always look at what is possible and what can I think of something that we can do because, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, but I want to try to think of things that actually we can do. And it feels to me like one of the reasons why people who are perhaps, less cultured, less educated, I don't know what words you're going to put around that, and feel intimidated to come into a building, less and not posh enough. I mean, I don't speak in the right way. Well, whatever. They're just feeling inadequate, feeling that this is not for them. And I just think that something like an hour of silence called Quaker Meeting for Worship, it's an intimidating space. And that's why I think that programming our meetings is an important thing to do. I think it's a critically important thing to do. And that without that structure, it's like literally. Do you remember? Did it happen in Northern Ireland, in Wales, to teach people to swim? In my grandparents' days, they got thrown into a river.
Mm, mm,
That was how they got taught to swim. All of them told me that. And of course, most of them couldn't swim and were terrified of water. And I think that was the point of it, to make them terrified of water, actually, rather than teaching them to swim. And it makes me feel like a completely unstructured first experience of Quaker meeting
mm.
is really difficult to get yourself into. And as you say, even 15 minutes is difficult. And I just wish we had some kind of starter experiences, However, meetings might do that, whether it's my thinking of programming the whole thing for the first hour or having a different session early on or whatever. I don't know. But I just think that programming or a semi-programmed meeting is crucial because the all age ones are good, but they can tend, I think for some people, they can find them a bit, obviously they're child-centered, and it's not for everyone.
So the other week when I was in Swansea, because sometimes I find myself in Swansea, you tried that out, didn't you, as a meeting where
Mm,
there was there was quotes from Quaker Faith and Practice around, and I think it worked in that there was a lot more local ministry
mm,
um, given. So, I mean, even things like, would it be, it shouldn't be breaking the rules sometimes just to say something at the start of a meeting, to say, this is how it works. Because, although I guess doorkeepers end up trying to do that to tell people, well, once you walk into the room, it will be quiet. But Zoom changed things as well, whereby we were a bit more like recognizing that we're people on Zoom and needed to acknowledge them, and how we ended things and maybe things that happened in between. So I don't think to maybe even just have an introduction at the start. It doesn't have to be long,
no.
which is thinking about the newcomer. Um, but let's hope that between now and say 12 months, we'll have seen uh, that says, oh, there is something. I mean, that stuck in my head about what I saw in Swansea. Um, but that's just one attempt, isn't it? And no
Yeah.
doubt you as a group will try we'll try different things.
Are you hopeful
Yeah.
for the future of Quakers and your meeting and your worshipping with Quakers? Is it a positive and hopeful, optimistic feeling you're left with?
Why am I delayed in my response? Um, I think we're at a critical number in our local meeting, and I know we can talk about COVID and what happened since COVID. COVID did do something, certainly. Stopped trends of people doing things. Um, I- I've learned to live in the moment, Emma, about life generally. So I don't get too future focused, but that's probably a coping mechanism. So I try to deal with the here and now and what's happening now. Um, but if you would ask me in 20 years, I don't know if there'll be a Quaker meeting in St. Albans. Certainly not formally in the meeting house. I don't think possibly unless something changes.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
you may have a bit like the group I'm talking about, although it's a bit insular as well, um, because it's feeding a niche where you can still have groups of people meeting together and doing what we do. Um, but it's going to be a bit niche, and even the CLC in some ways can be a bit niche. Um, so I think it could still exist, but it's about looking at, well, is there a power within this that touches people's lives? If there's a power that's a spiritual power in some ways, whatever that is, it will touch people's lives. If it's not, then like lots of movements, it could have its time. So it, I think I could say this that the future of Quakerism as a spiritual religious movement will be dependent on its willingness to acknowledge the spiritual source from which it originated,
mm.
and not just acknowledge it, allow it to be, as in alive and
Mm.
like what you said, moving. How's the spirit moving in your meetings? Um, but that in itself is going to could cause some people difficulty. We know that, and
Yeah.
that's what we're up against. Is that some people think, what are you talking about? That's a load of nonsense. But then you have to say, what have you got then? Have you got like a social movement, like the Temperance Society or something?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
and it was powerful at its time, but you don't get too many temperance societies now. Um, so yeah, it's good that it's just me and you talking, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm sure a lot of
Well,
people would be objected to what we're saying or go, you
Well,
can't say
and
that.
it feels like a lot of these conversations feels like part one, because it just takes a long time to
Mm.
think these things through. And I think in the end we'll want to do a follow-up where we've kind of come up with all the answers for our questions today. So,
Well, you don't know where I mean, this journey, I think, is already been an amazing journey for you, and you don't know where this is going.
no,
But right now it's going. Right now it's going, and it's me and you talking now. But so
that's
that's
right.
what the moment is.
And I'm just
But
enjoying
yeah,
them. I'm just really
sure.
enjoying all of these conversations because it's clearly something that's of interest to people. Otherwise, we wouldn't sit here and talk for an hour and a half. So, but having said that, we must bring it to a close at some point. I mean, is there anything else that you had in mind that you wanted to talk about that we haven't?
I think we've covered most things in the hour and a half.
Yeah, exactly.
Is No, I can't. Nothing. As I said, you start. I go with what comes,
Yeah,
and there's nothing coming. So
yeah.
you've talked me or the spirit out, Emma.
Well, it's been a pleasure as always, Gordon. Thank you very much for your time. So we'll leave it there and maybe catch up to do it again in
Sure,
the future.
sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.